This is Ed Salzberg, Managing Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum. On June 28, 2011, from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we're hosting the third in SSF's series of complementary webinars addressing how to adapt to the variety of national security threats from a changing climate. I'll introduce the webinar lineup at the end of this 5-minute video, but today's purpose is to interview the moderator of the third session, which is on physical infrastructure adaptation. The moderator is Lynn Scarlett. She's co-director of Resources for the Future's Center for the Management of Ecological Wealth. At the heart of this responsibility is research and analysis to evaluate the economic benefits of natural systems. Lynn was also formerly Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior. How to build the resilience necessary for effective infrastructure investments in a changing climate is one of her primary areas of expertise. Lynn, we've talked about this before, but would you explain why infrastructure adaptation is such an important topic to include in this series?
With climate change unfolding, we're seeing many changes on the landscape. We're seeing increased frequency of very high-intensity storm events. That results in more stormwater challenges, flooding. We've seen last year flooding across the nation in many states, for example, not necessarily directly attributed to climate change, but many analysts suggest that those kinds of problems are what we will see looming ahead. We see sea level rise and the challenges that presents to coastal infrastructure, where an ever-growing portion of the U.S. population lives. So we need to figure out what these effects are, and then with our infrastructure, how we need to be rethinking it, changing it to better address and reduce risks associated with climate change.
And in terms of the panel members, why did you pick these particular people for the session?
Well, I think we have a perfect mix with Kevin Schaefer, who is Executive Director at the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. He is directly engaged in trying to figure out how to handle stormwater events. Our old-fashioned pipes across the nation in cities, sometimes 100 years old, just can't handle the capacity of sewage or stormwater that results in sewage overflows in our cities. And so Kevin is right there in the middle of that, trying to figure out what to do. Does he spend billions of dollars building bigger and bigger pipes? Does he actually try to use some of nature's capital, if you will, restore some floodplains, green the city, try to transform permeable or impermeable surfaces to more permeable surfaces with soil and grass so that water can percolate down through them? So he can give us a city perspective, what cities are doing with real infrastructure in real places and with constrained dollars to figure out how to serve their people better, cheaper, smarter. With Lynn Patton, we get a big picture and indeed even global perspective. Lynn is Chief Climate Product Officer at the Zurich Financial Services. They, of course, provide a lot of insurance products to companies and others around the world. And what they're seeing is increased risks associated with high-intensity storms, whether they're hurricanes or otherwise. And again, as an insurance company, facing enormous costs if they fail to work with their customers to try and reduce those risks. So she can bring a perspective on what those risks are, how they're working with companies and other clients across the world to try and figure out ways to minimize flooding, minimize damages from coastal storms, and similar kinds of challenges. With Paul Harrison, we have someone who comes out of the environmental community. He is Senior Director of the Mississippi River Project at the Environmental Defense Fund. And Paul has been working on the Louisiana Gulf Coast, both in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and other challenges, the Gulf Coast oil spill and so forth, looking at that whole system, looking at challenges of sea level rise presented by climate change, looking at the major transformations of that coastal system that have resulted from the channelizing of the Mississippi River, and again looking at questions such as how do we reduce those risks from hurricanes, how do we reduce flooding, but perhaps do so with a lighter environmental footprint, restoring some floodplains, recreating some of those diversion channels or some of those waterways that kind of reach off the Mississippi River and helped in the past create the delta, which in turn provides a protective system against the human communities that live down there. So Paul brings the lens of an environmentalist, but working on real day-to-day practical problem solving down at the Louisiana Gulf Coast. Lynn gives us a worldwide perspective, and Kevin gives us the perspective of a city manager that has to work with infrastructure and in the context of constrained budgets and try to solve problems.
That's a really powerful group to bring into the session. We really appreciate you being able to pull them in. I've learned a lot just listening to the way you're approaching the issue. But from your standpoint, who should come? Who's going to get the most out of coming to this session, and what are they going to learn?
Just about any resource manager, public or private sector, I think could benefit, whether one is at the federal level in an agency and has infrastructure to manage and decisions to make about dams and dam protection, levees, flooding and flood protection, whether one's at the state level and or at the city level. I think there will be things to learn about doing vulnerability assessments to resources from climate change, but then also some of the solutions, including some of the green solutions, moving away from gray infrastructure to green. But also many people in the private sector will benefit too. So many companies, for example, have facilities along coasts, and those are in jeopardy with increasing sea level and, of course, also from increased flooding and high-intensity storms. One just needs to throw a dart on the map this past year, just about anywhere in the U.S., and one saw flooding, for example. So private sector and public sector resource managers, people who work with infrastructure, particularly people who have any linkage to water and water systems, I think they would really benefit from coming to this session. More broadly, people interested in better understanding, at least at a kind of 10,000-foot level, what some of the effects of a changing climate are on land, water, and wildlife would benefit from this session.
It really sounds like anyone from those maybe new to the field are going to learn a lot from it, but the real professionals are going to get a chance to listen to discussions from true experts in the field.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, there's a lot of work going on in cities and in agencies to address the effects of climate change, but what each of these three people bring is very professional and specific knowledge. They're doers. In the case of Kevin, he has to make real decisions about real infrastructure pertaining to stormwater and sewage management. In the case of Paul, out of the environmental community, he's not a theoretician per se. He's actually a doer. He's down there figuring out with the community, should there be more levees? Should there be restoration of floodplains? Should there be some diversion channels so the Mississippi River can recreate or redeposit sediment to build up the coast? And then, of course, with Lynn too, very familiar with the real nuts and bolts of vulnerability assessments and risk assessment that just about anybody, professional or new to the field, might benefit from hearing.
Lynn, we're really fortunate to have you play the leadership role in this third webinar. The registrations are actually at record level for this time in the rollout of the program, and we're nearly at the ceiling for the event. So those of you listening, please don't wait to sign up for the session so that you're not disappointed.
SSF's 5-part Adaptation and Security complimentary webinar series will continue through the fall of 2011. The first two sessions were an introduction and then a session on food and water adaptation. Following Lynn's webinar, the final sessions will address public health and also maintaining economic growth. Check the SSF website for the schedules, and you can also sign up for email alerts on these and other SSF-produced events. This is Ed Salzberg, the Managing Director of the Security and Sustainability Forum, and speaking for the directors and the entire organization, I invite you to participate in this educational series.